The light is fading over the wheat fields of Nebraska. September, 1944. The air smells of turned earth and the first cool breath of autumn. Long shadows stretch across the stubble where the harvest has just finished, and in the distance, fireflies begin their slow dance above the fence line. Beneath the wide-open doors of a weathered barn, a table has been set. It's nothing fancy, just wooden planks laid across sawhorses, covered with a checkered cloth that's seen better days. But the plates are real china, saved for occasions that matter. Steam rises from bowls of mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, and cornbread still warm from the oven. There's a pitcher of cold water beating with condensation, and jars of preserves catching the last amber light. And then they come. A group of young men in faded uniforms, walking slowly across the field. Their boots are caked with mud. Their faces are cautious, unreadable. They move with the stiff uncertainty of people who aren't sure if they're allowed to be here or if this moment is even real. These men are Japanese soldiers. Prisoners of war. Just months ago, they were fighting in the Pacific, Saipan, maybe, or Tinian. They'd been taught that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that the Americans would torture them, that capture was the end of everything. And yet here they are, thousands of miles from home, standing at the edge of a harvest dinner hosted by the very people they'd been told to hate. The farmer, a man in his 50s with sun-worn hands and a tired smile, gestures toward the table. His wife stands beside him, wiping her hands on her apron, nodding. There's no speech. No ceremony. Just an invitation that shouldn't make sense in the middle of a war. The soldiers hesitate. One of them glances back toward the guard standing at a distance, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The guard shrugs. Go ahead. And slowly, one by one, they step forward. This is where the story begins, at a table set between two worlds, where the impossible became real. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to rewind. You have to go back to the islands. The Pacific War was hell in a way that defies easy description. Jungles so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Heat that turned your uniform into a second skin of sweat and grime. Coral atolls where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. The Japanese soldiers who ended up in Nebraska had lived through Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, places where the fighting was so brutal that survival felt like an accident. They'd been told they were fighting for the emperor, for honor, for a cause that transcended their individual lives. Surrender was unthinkable. The military code drilled into them from childhood, Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded death before dishonor. And yet, when the moment came, some of them chose to live. Maybe they were wounded, too weak to resist. Maybe they were cut off from their units, starving and delirious. Maybe, in a moment of quiet desperation, they simply decided that survival mattered more than the code. The transition from combat to captivity was jarring. One day, you're diving into a foxhole as artillery tears the jungle apart. The next, you're on a transport ship, headed east across an ocean you never thought you'd cross. The soldiers were stripped of their weapons, their rank, their identity. They became numbers. Enemy aliens. POWs. And then America. Not the America they'd been warned about. Not the land of barbaric savages who would execute prisoners without mercy. Instead, they arrived in places like Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, wide-open farmland where the loudest sound was the wind moving through cornfields. The contrast was almost unbearable. The silence felt heavier than the artillery ever had. They were assigned to labor camps, hastily constructed facilities near rural towns desperate for workers. The war had pulled so many young American men overseas that the farms were struggling. Crops were rotting in the fields. Harvests were at risk. And so, in a pragmatic twist of wartime logic, the government decided to put POWs to work. For the Japanese soldiers, it was disorienting. They were given tools, shovels, hoes, pitchforks, and told to work the land. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, flat and golden under a sky bigger than anything they'd seen back home. There were no guards with bayonets hovering over them. No threats. Just the expectation that they would work, and at the end of the day, they would eat and sleep and wake up to do it again. It was so quiet they could hear themselves think. And that, in its own way, was terrifying. The decision to bring Japanese POWs to the American heartland wasn't just about labor. It was also an experiment, one rooted in idealism, strategy, and a belief that the war could be won not just on battlefields, but in the minds of the enemy. The Geneva Convention set the rules. POWs were to be treated humanely, housed adequately, and put to work in jobs that didn't directly support the war effort. In practice, this meant farms, logging camps, and factories. But the American approach went further. There was a deliberate effort to expose Japanese prisoners to a version of America that contradicted everything their propaganda had told them. The thinking went like this: if these men saw Americans as reasonable, even kind, they might return to Japan after the war and spread a different story. Maybe it wouldn't change the outcome of the conflict, but it might plant seeds for a different kind of peace. Local communities were encouraged to participate. Farmers who needed labor were given guidelines: treat the POWs fairly, pay them a small wage, follow the rules. Some communities resisted. After all, these were men who'd fought against American boys, brothers, sons, husbands who might never come home. The anger was real, and in some places, it festered. But in other places, something else happened. Curiosity, practicality, and eventually, a grudging respect. The farmers didn't know what to expect. They'd seen the newsreels images of banzai charges, kamikaze pilots, brutal jungle warfare. They'd been told the Japanese were fanatics who would never surrender, who valued death over life. And yet the men who arrived to work their fields were quiet, polite, and startlingly disciplined. The guards, too, had their assumptions challenged. Many had signed up expecting to oversee dangerous prisoners who needed constant surveillance. Instead, they found themselves watching men who bowed before receiving orders, who worked with meticulous care, and who never caused trouble. Some guards became almost protective. Others remained distant, unwilling to let go of the wartime narrative. And then there were the farmers themselves, men and women who'd lived their whole lives in these small towns, who'd never thought much about Japan or the Pacific or any of it. For them, the POWs were just workers. At first. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, something shifted. They noticed things. The way a soldier would pause to straighten a crooked row of plants. The way another would offer a shy smile when handed a drink of water. The way they seemed grateful for the smallest kindness. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it was the beginning of something that hadn't existed before: recognition. The slow, uncomfortable realization that the enemy had a face. The work was hard. That was the one constant, the shared language that didn't need translation. At dawn, the POWs would line up outside the barracks, sometimes 20 of them, sometimes more, while the guard checked the roster and assigned the day's tasks. Then they'd climb into the back of a flatbed truck, riding in silence down dirt roads until they reached the fields. The farmers would be waiting, leaning against fence posts or standing beside tractors, watching as the men climbed down and took their positions. The first few days were tense. The farmers didn't speak Japanese. The POWs spoke almost no English. Instructions were given through gestures: point at a row, mime the motion of a hoe, nod when the task was understood. Mistakes were inevitable. A furrow plowed too deep. A fence post driven in crooked. A bucket of water spilled. But the Japanese soldiers adapted quickly. They worked with a precision that surprised the farmers. Every row was perfectly straight. Every tool was returned to its place. Every task was completed with an almost ritualistic care. It wasn't just about following orders, it was something deeper, something cultural. A sense of duty that transcended captivity. The farmers noticed. They didn't say much about it, but they noticed. One farmer in Iowa later recalled watching a POW spend an extra 10 minutes smoothing out a section of plowed earth that was already good enough. "I thought he was wasting time," the farmer said. "But then I realized he wasn't doing it for me. He was doing it for himself. He couldn't stand the thought of leaving it messy." There was also competition, unspoken but unmistakable. The soldiers wanted to prove they could work as hard as anyone, that they weren't weak or broken. They pushed themselves through the heat, through exhaustion, through blistered hands and aching backs. Some farmers tried to match them, not wanting to be shown up by prisoners. It became a strange, silent contest: who could outlast the sun, who could finish first, who could prove their resilience. And yet, for all the hard work, there were moments of unexpected humor. A mule that refused to budge, no matter how much the farmer yelled, suddenly obeying when a POW whispered something in Japanese and tugged gently on the reins. A soldier's attempt to mimic the farmer's exaggerated hand gestures, which made everyone, guards included, crack a smile. A shared laugh when a chicken escaped its coop and led everyone on a ridiculous chase across the yard. These moments were small, fleeting, but they mattered. Because in those brief instances, the walls came down. The roles of captor and captive blurred. For just a second, they were all just people, stuck in a situation none of them had chosen, trying to make the best of it. Trust didn't come all at once. It accumulated slowly, like dust settling on a windowsill. A gesture here, a nod there, a cautious exchange of words. By late summer, the suspicion had eased, replaced by something quieter: acceptance, maybe. Or at least the absence of fear. It started with gloves. One afternoon in late August, a farmer named Henry Miller noticed that one of the POWs, a young man, maybe 22 or 23, was working with bare hands. The skin on his palms was raw, bleeding in places from gripping the wooden handle of a pitchfork all day. Henry didn't think much about it. He just walked over, pulled off his own work gloves, and handed them to the soldier. The young man stared at the gloves for a long moment, as if he didn't understand what was happening. Then he looked up at Henry, confusion giving way to something else: gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. He bowed deeply, more deeply than necessary, and accepted the gloves with both hands. Henry just nodded and walked away. That night, the soldier carved a small wooden figure, a crane, delicate and precise, and left it on the fence post where Henry would find it the next morning. Henry kept that crane on his mantle for the rest of his life. Kindness, it turned out, was contagious. A farmer's wife started packing extra sandwiches in her husband's lunch, knowing he'd share them with the POWs. A guard began teaching a few of the soldiers basic English phrases: good morning, thank you, water, please, partly out of practicality, partly because he was bored. One POW, who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, started sketching portraits of the farmhands during lunch breaks, offering them as gifts. These gestures were never grand. They weren't meant to be. But they carried weight because they were personal, specific, and unexpected. In a world defined by propaganda and hatred, these small acts of decency felt radical. For the Japanese soldiers, each moment of kindness chipped away at the narrative they'd been taught. They'd been told that Americans were cruel, that surrender meant torture and humiliation. And yet here was a farmer's daughter offering them cold lemonade on a hot day. Here was a rancher fixing a soldier's broken shoelace without being asked. Here was a guard who looked the other way when one of the POWs wanted to sit in the shade for an extra few minutes. It didn't erase the war. It didn't undo the pain on either side. But it forced a reckoning. If the Americans were supposed to be monsters, why were they acting like this? If the enemy was supposed to be inhuman, why did they keep proving otherwise? The soldiers didn't talk about it much among themselves: it felt too dangerous, too disloyal. But they noticed. And slowly, quietly, their understanding of the world shifted. The propaganda had lied. Not about everything, maybe. But about this. About the people. About the possibility of something other than hate. By mid-September, the harvest was nearly finished. The fields had been cleared, the crops stored away, and the relentless work of summer was finally winding down. There was a tradition in these farming communities: a harvest dinner, a way to celebrate the end of the season and thank everyone who'd contributed. It was a big deal. Families cooked for days. Tables were set outdoors or in barns. There was music, sometimes, and always too much food. And this year, one family made a decision that would ripple far beyond that single evening. The Johnsons, Tom and Margaret, along with their 2 teenage sons, had been hosting POWs on their farm since June. They'd watched these young men work themselves to exhaustion, had seen their quiet discipline and their shy gratitude. And Margaret, in particular, had been troubled by something she couldn't quite name. These boys, because that's what they were, really, just boys, had been so far from home, so completely cut off from anything familiar. They'd worked hard. They'd caused no trouble. And they'd been kind, in their own way. So Margaret told Tom, "We're inviting them to the harvest dinner." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "But the guard's going to think we've lost our minds." He wasn't wrong. When Tom approached the supervising officer and made the request, the man looked at him like he'd suggested inviting a pack of wolves to a church picnic. "You want to do what?" the guard asked, incredulous. "Invite them to dinner," Tom repeated. "It's the harvest meal. They helped bring it in. Seems right." The guard shook his head, more out of disbelief than refusal. "I'll have to check with my CO," he said. "But if you're serious, I'll see what I can do." Word spread quickly among the POWs. At first, they didn't believe it. An invitation? To sit at a table with an American family? It didn't make sense. Some thought it was a test, a trap of some kind. Others wondered if they'd misunderstood. One soldier, a man named Takeshi, who'd been a student before the war, couldn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the words in his mind, trying to understand what they meant. Back home, sharing a meal was sacred. It was an act of trust, of inclusion. If the Americans were offering this, it wasn't just about food. It was about something deeper. But could they accept? Should they? The camp was buzzing with quiet conversations, whispered debates in the darkness. Some soldiers felt it was inappropriate, they were prisoners, after all. Others were simply afraid. What if they did something wrong? What if this kindness was somehow a trick? In the end, the decision was made for them. The commanding officer approved the request, and the soldiers were told, "You're going. It's an order." And so, on a cool September evening, they prepared themselves for a meal they couldn't yet imagine. The barn smelled like home, at least, someone's home. Wood smoke and roasting meat, fresh bread and butter, the earthy sweetness of cooked carrots and potatoes. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm, flickering light across the long table. The evening air was soft, carrying the last warmth of summer and the first promise of fall. The POWs arrived just before sunset, walking in a loose group with the guard trailing behind. They were dressed in their cleanest uniforms, which wasn't saying much. The fabric was worn and patched, the colors faded from months of sun and labor. But they'd made an effort. Hair combed, boots as clean as they could get them. A few carried small gifts, carved wooden trinkets, folded paper cranes, uncertain gestures offered with both hands and deep bows. Margaret met them at the barn door. She smiled, a real smile, and gestured toward the table. "Please," she said. "Sit." The soldiers hesitated, glancing at each other. Finally, one of them, Takeshi, stepped forward and bowed. "Thank you," he said in careful, halting English. The others followed, moving slowly toward the benches. The Johnsons sat down first, as if to show that this was normal, that there was nothing strange about breaking bread with men who'd been enemies just months before. Tom poured water into glasses. Margaret passed around bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, sliced ham. The sons, awkward and curious, watched the POWs with wide eyes. For the first few minutes, the only sounds were forks scraping plates and the quiet murmur of wind outside. The soldiers ate carefully, almost reverently, savoring every bite. Some of them hadn't tasted food like this in years, home-cooked, abundant, offered freely. One soldier closed his eyes as he chewed, and for just a moment, his face softened. Then Tom spoke. He didn't say much, just a simple thank you for the work they'd done, an acknowledgement that the harvest wouldn't have been possible without them. One of the POWs, who understood a little English, translated quietly for the others. They nodded, murmuring their own thanks in Japanese. And then something remarkable happened. One of the soldiers reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, a picture of his family back in Japan. He showed it to Margaret, pointing to each person and saying their names. Margaret leaned in, nodding, her expression gentle. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Family. Home. The things that connected all of them, no matter which side of the war they were on. Another soldier pulled out a photograph. Then another. Soon the table was covered with small, creased images, mothers and fathers, siblings, children. The Johnsons shared their own photos, pointing and smiling. The language barrier didn't matter. This conversation needed no translation. As the meal went on, the tension dissolved. Someone laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh, at something one of the sons said. The sound broke the ice, and suddenly everyone was a little more relaxed. Tom refilled glasses. Margaret brought out a pie, still warm, and the soldiers' eyes widened in amazement. One of them tried to politely refuse, insisting it was too much, but Margaret waved him off and cut generous slices for everyone. By the time the lanterns burned low and the evening turned to night, something had shifted. The soldiers were still prisoners. The Johnsons were still the enemy. The war was still raging across the ocean. But for a few hours, none of that mattered. What mattered was the table. The food. The shared humanity that no amount of propaganda could erase. When the soldiers stood to leave, they bowed deeply again and again, trying to convey a gratitude that words couldn't capture. Tom and Margaret stood at the barn door, watching them walk back across the field, their silhouettes fading into the dusk. Margaret turned to her husband. "Do you think they'll remember this?" she asked. Tom didn't answer right away. He just watched until the last soldier disappeared into the darkness. "I think we all will," he said. The war ended. The soldiers went home, or at least, most of them did. Some stayed in the camps for months after Japan's surrender, waiting for ships to carry them back across the Pacific. Others returned to a homeland shattered by defeat, their cities reduced to rubble, their families scattered or gone. But they carried something with them. A memory. A meal shared in a Nebraska barn, on a September evening that felt like a dream. Years later, some of those men wrote letters. They sent them to the addresses they'd memorized: Tom and Margaret Johnson, rural Nebraska, USA, hoping the letters would somehow find their way. Some did. In broken English, they described what that night had meant. How it had changed the way they thought about America, about the war, about the possibility of kindness in a world defined by cruelty. One letter, yellowed and fragile, is preserved in a local museum now. It reads, "I never forgot your faces. I never forgot the taste of that bread. I never forgot that you treated me like a person, not an enemy. Thank you. I wish I could say it better." The Johnsons kept those letters in a box in the attic. They didn't talk about them much. It wasn't the kind of thing you bragged about in a small town where some people still carried deep wounds from the war. But on quiet evenings, Margaret would take the box down and read the letters again. And she'd remember the young men who'd sat at her table, so far from home, so uncertain and so grateful. Even in the darkest wars, there are moments of grace. Moments that defy logic and propaganda and hate. Moments that remind us what we're capable of when we choose to see each other as human. That harvest dinner was one of those moments. And its echo carried forward, long after the last plate was cleared and the lanterns were extinguished, a quiet testament to the enduring power of unexpected kindness.